Hello, welcome back to the Matt Pfeiffer Experience. I am your host, Matthew Pfeiffer, and today we have on a very special guest out of Los Angeles, California. His name is Parag Amin, and I cannot wait for you guys to hear some of the knowledge that he has to drop. We're going to be talking about high stakes litigation, high stakes partner litigation, when people go into business with each other. And this is a different type of divorce that doesn't really get talked about often enough is when there's a divorce of a partnership, when people go into business together. That can be in a in a family relationship. That also can be you and your significant other have built this business up and are separating. And how does that all play out? This is something that isn't talked about enough. So I'm looking forward to having this conversation. But without further ado, let me introduce you to our guest, and let's go ahead and get the show started. Parag, thank you very much for hopping on and tell us a little bit more about yourself. How did you get started?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on, by the way. So, I've got my own practice in Los Angeles, California. I started it a little over 10 years ago, and the reason I got into law in the first place is my parents had immigrated to the United States from India, and he had taken his life savings and he had invested it in this store. So, we lived in New York and he invested it in this store in Florida. So, we moved down to Florida so he and my mom could try to make this store successful, and him and my mom were working 60, 70, 80 hours a week trying to make their American dream come true. And I hardly saw them during that time. I spent a lot of time with my grandmother, who was my primary caretaker during that time. And after a couple years of trying to make it, my dad has the taxing authority of Florida come knocking and they tell him, "Hey, you owe over $200,000
Wow.
in unpaid sales taxes." So my dad's really confused by it. He says, "It's not possible. There's some kind of mistake." And they say there's no mistake. So here's what my dad didn't know. So my dad bought the entity, meaning the company that owned the store, and
Mm.
he had paid his sales taxes, but the guy who owned the company before him hadn't paid his portion of the sales taxes. And so since he had bought the entity, he also bought all the problems with it. So
Yeah.
my dad was faced with the tough decision of either one, pay what's owed from the other guy, or two, shut down the business. So my dad made the really tough decision to shut down the business and lose pretty much all of his life savings. So we then bounced around a little bit because my dad was trying to regain his footing, but he's got a young family that he's got to support. And ultimately, he ended up going back to a W-2 job because he had to support his family. So he lost his kind of American dream of entrepreneurship. So at a
Yeah.
relatively young age, I decided that I wanted to go to law school and prevent that from happening to people I loved, from people I cared about, or to other people. So eventually, I went on to law school. I pursued that passion. I did my undergraduate in finance because I also had a sense from an early age that finance and law are like two very big components
Yeah.
of success here in the United States. So I wanted to make sure that I had a good background in that and also that I could help my clients in the future with those kinds of things. So went on to law school, came out to Los Angeles to go to law school at USC. I graduated and I started my own law firm little after a year after graduating. So our primary clients are business owners, typically somewhere between $1 million to $10 million in revenue, who are going through many traumatic kinds of issues and disputes, high stakes litigation, including a number of cases involving partnership disputes, which you might be surprised, but these kinds of things affect all kinds of business owners. Whether it's we've had construction clients, we've had doctors, we've even had other lawyers come and hire my firm for these kinds of disputes. So no one is immune to them, no one is above them. And as you know, these things can any kind of divorce, whether it's a business divorce or a
Yeah.
romantic divorce, can be highly emotional and very, very many times they usually are.
Yeah, and when you mention all this, and saying, when we talk about the similarities, a lot of times with a husband wife divorce, we look at the quote unquote relationship goals and we say to ourselves, well, there's no possible way that they could ever have any problems and things like that. And so one of the kind of point out, one of the things that you mentioned is that the type of clients that you work with are between 1 and 10 million, 10 million in revenue. And oftentimes people hear those types of numbers and they just assume they don't have any problems, that there's no possible way that they can have any sort of financial problems. And even if they did, it wouldn't be that big of a deal to, just wipe away with the money and the income that they have coming in. But in some cases, that's not the case. How would someone know that maybe they are headed down a path? Like if I were talking to someone about a divorce, like saying like, these are the things that are heading, you might be heading towards a divorce. How would someone know they are heading towards like a possible litigation limit, in a business setting?
Great question. And it's interesting because it's probably similar to what might be leading couples down to a romantic divorce, which is
Yeah.
uh, typically it's related to some aspect of finances, meaning somebody's taking too much money out of the business, somebody's not doing enough work in the business, not supporting the business, not supporting the relationship, turning out to do things differently than what their partner thought they would be doing,
Right.
what they believed their partner would be doing based on prior discussions, or maybe they never had discussions. And that, I think, is a primary driver of these kinds of issues. Is many times the partner simply assumed the other partner would either continue doing what they've already been doing, or that the partner would start doing more than what they're doing because they understood the gravity of getting into a business relationship and growing a business. But unfortunately, many times when those conversations haven't been had, when the problem is still hypothetical, it becomes much harder to deal with when the problem is actual.
Yeah.
Because now nobody wants to deal with the headaches and heartaches of actually solving the problem because they think that the other person was supposed to resolve it, not them. And that typically causes things to escalate.
Do you think that people who, let's just use finances as an example, who overspend, take too much money out, are those, in your experience, have those moments been intentional, or was it just someone that was really actually just poor with money management?
Great question. I think it's probably a combination of both, and it depends on how you define intentional. So, not to get all lawyerly about this, but the idea of the intention of somebody taking money out of the business. So, is the intent taking the money out of the business? Surely they knew they were doing that.
Right.
So that part of it was intentional. Now, if the question is, well, is the intent then to try to destroy or harm the business or the other partner? Many times I think the answer is that it's not necessarily intentional to harm the other partner, but the partner who's taking too much money out of the business is
Right.
taking that money out intentionally. But many times they're self-justifying it and saying, well, I deserve this money because of X. I think human beings by nature have to justify their actions one way or another. So they'll come up with reasons that they believe are completely logical or reasonable as to why they took the money out of the business. So if you ask them, "Hey, did you steal money from the business?" Almost no one is going to admit to doing that. What
Right.
they're going to say is, "Oh, this is my money. I'm entitled to it. I worked for it. So I simply took out what I was entitled to."
Yeah. What does the law say about things like that? Because if it's a 50-50 partnership or 51-49, are they technically by law entitled to it? Is it kind of dependent on how contracts are written up? How are decisions made, and how do you either A, negotiate or litigate that once it's your table?
So it's a great question because the law provides certain guidelines, but they're relatively broad, and it's up to the parties to narrow those by using contracts. So
Yeah.
if the parties don't have a written agreement, which many times occurs, or they have a written agreement, but they've gotten it off the internet, they downloaded it off Google, or used a company like LegalZoom, but didn't actually have a lawyer think through the issues, when the problems become a reality, those contracts are typically too vague and don't provide enough clarity
Yeah.
about how to handle the situation. So I'll give you a perfect example where the law would view this as completely on the wrong side of things. And then I'll give you another example where the law says, well, I don't think that this is necessarily illegal. So,
Yeah.
for example, in one case, this case literally went to trial and we won the trial. But as I'm on cross examination, meaning I'm asking the other side questions, to get to the truth of the matter, I confronted him with the fact that he actually withdrew money from the company's bank account at the casino, and he withdrew thousands of dollars at the casino.
Yeah.
So his response was, I needed to blow off steam because it's a really stressful business and I needed some stress relief. I've earned this money and this is how I function. So it was completely okay. So I asked him, so you don't deny that you withdrew money at the casino and used it? He's like, no, I don't deny that. I did.
Right.
I did do it. And even the judge started laughing when that answer came out because it was so clearly unlawful doing something like that there's no question. But then you have other circumstances where somebody might pull some money out. For example, they've taken, let's say, $20,000 out of the business, and they might fully intend to repay it back. Or they take it out as an owner's distribution, meaning they've taken that money out, and without getting into the complexities too much, in short, that's supposed to get accounted for in their capital account. So they've pulled this money out, but then the business runs into some issues, and then there's a question, meaning the individual had enough in their capital account to be able to withdraw this money or to be able to take a loan out, but they haven't discussed it with their partner. And then it becomes a question of, was it lawfully or properly taken out of the business? So that gets into a gray area where it's not clear. Meaning if things become problematic, then there's going to be an argument that it was unlawfully taken out. But inevitably, when a partner is doing that, sometimes most of the time, there's at least one occasion where the other partner has done it. So it has established some kind of precedent of this is how we do things. So it becomes very hard for the partner who hadn't taken money out the most recent time to say, wait a second, we never agreed that you were allowed to do this. And
but the other partner justifies it because they saw or they can speak to the fact that the other partner did it at one time or another.
Exactly. Even if the amounts are drastically different.
Yeah.
So what a lot of people don't realize is in the world of partnerships and business disputes, co-owners are entitled to some kind of latitude under what's called the business judgment rule, meaning somebody's not required or even expected to make perfect decisions every time.
Right.
So if a reasonable business person would have made that decision or could have made that decision, then it can be protected under the business judgment rule, even if that decision turns out to be the completely wrong decision. The idea is to protect business owners from simply getting things wrong and then facing some kind of significant personal liability because they made a judgment call that was still reasonable or potentially reasonable under the circumstances, but it just happened to be wrong.
Yeah.
So because of that broad latitude on the business judgment rule, many times decisions that partners make will get protected under that for better or worse. So it's much easier when you have a written document that lays out exactly what the partners are allowed to do, not allowed to do, what's expected of each one, because then there's a higher level of accountability where somebody can say, here's where you went wrong. This is a clear violation of the agreement at these places.
I want to kind of collide our worlds together in terms of, me working with high conflict divorce, and obviously you with businesses. Sure, I know you've worked with a lot of people who are going through divorce who may have been in business together. I've worked with a lot of people who are going through divorce who were in business together and those sorts of things. How does it work in your world in on the business side of things when things are more on the emotional side and not so much on the things that are a little bit more clear cut with finances and this and that? So one partner cheats with the other partner's wife, or husband, and causes a very clear rift. Or husband and wife are in partnership together and they want to go through a divorce, and it's high, maybe there's domestic violence or one person just feels like they're doing all of the work, and they're splitting the business 50-50. How is that viewed in court, or is that something that just absolutely has to be settled outside of court, in particular when neither one of them wants to give up their end of the business?
So the emotional aspects of things, typically judges don't like hearing about them. They don't properly belong in a business dispute case as it relates to the law. But the law is very rigid in many aspects, whereas human beings are much more flexible. They could have good days, bad days, and there's a lot more emotion in human beings than in the law. And so what happens is those kinds of disputes when it comes to romantic relationships, which I dealt with a number of these situations where there's a romantic relationship and there's a business relationship. And almost always, when the romantic relationship falls apart, at that point or shortly thereafter, the business relationship falls apart. And somehow the issues from the romantic relationship and what the person was doing wrong or supposedly doing wrong now have crept into the business allegations. And there's a lot of finger pointing by
Right.
both sides against the other about how they're always like this and how they're never reasonable. So it does make the dispute much harder and more expensive to resolve. And many times, unfortunately, the business relationship suffers from the same shortcomings and shortfalls as the romantic relationship. So if they'd simply had the conversations they needed to have for both, I think the romantic relationship, which is totally more your realm, and I'm sure you could speak to that, and if they had similar conversations for the business relationship of what do we expect from each other, let's get some more formality around this, then I think it would have made it a lot less traumatic when things fell apart.
So in a situation like that, if one or both people were just hardcore, like I'm not giving up my end of it, does the judge then eventually just make a decision and just says, well, you guys are just going to be in business together for the rest of your lives until one of you guys decides to give this up, or is it that they force a decision one way or the other?
They do force a decision and they can force a sale. So because of these ideas of which I completely agree with, this idea of free will and not being forced to do something or be in a relationship with somebody in the United States if you don't want to be, the courts generally respect that. So what
Yeah.
they'll say is if one partner wants out, they can force a dissolution of the business, meaning the business can be dissolved and sold, or the business can be dissolved and its parts can be sold, or the business can be sold holistically.
Mm.
Or you simply dissolve the whole business, and then whatever money's left, whatever assets are left, get divvied up by the court if the parties can't agree, and everybody goes their separate ways.
Do do you see that happening more often, or do you see where people just eventually just resolve, come to terms or some sort of agreement, like through mediation?
So most cases will resolve through prior to trial, whether that's
Yeah.
in mediation or through the attorneys working together to try to get it resolved for the clients. But I think this is also where the right guidance is so critical because some litigation lawyers only have the ability to litigate. They don't
Yeah.
have the empathy. They don't have the understanding of how do we get this resolved efficiently for the parties. So at what point matters resolve and how favorably they resolve, I think also speak a large volume to that. So for example, I've been able to take cases where I know that there's a heavy emotional component because there is also a romantic relationship in addition to the business relationship in this partnership dispute. And so there were some non-financial components arising from that romantic relationship that we were able to leverage and use to help get a more favorable financial outcome where it didn't
Yeah.
cost my client anything else. And it was a lot more money for her. So to be able to resolve it this way. So I think there's aspects to this where having the right people guiding you in terms of what is the best way to resolve this and not necessarily needlessly escalating things
Hmm.
is is the right way to do it. And I think many
Right.
times that is what drives the best outcomes for
Yeah.
people.
What would you say, for someone who is, their business right now is thriving, and maybe they're looking at a partnership, or maybe they're looking at getting married, or and maybe their significant other has aspirations to join a business or has their own business that they're looking at partnering up. Um, what are some ways that people can make things? I don't want to say make things work, but create some green flags, I would say, in their partnership to where Let's build this right from the beginning. I like if I were going to give an example, like whenever I tell people who are considering getting married, I tell people it's always going to end and it's going to end regardless, either at death or divorce. So you need a prenup and you also need, plans on what's going to happen in the event of one or both people's passing. What are some preparation things that people can do in preparation for some sort of business partnership to help protect them, protect the business, and also to help protect the partner as well?
Having the tough discussions ahead of time with the right guidance, I think, is critical.
Yeah,
Meaning, whenever anybody gets, I think, into a relationship, especially at the beginning, there's a lot of excitement and there's a lot of optimism about how things are going to be great, and no one really wants to go to that uncomfortable, painful place of what if things don't work out the way we'd like to. And everybody generally wants to keep that good momentum going, keep those good spirits alive, and I completely for that. But I think it's very important to help all of that thrive, to have those tough conversations, because if
yeah,
the relationship cannot withstand a tough conversation, how's it going to withstand a tough time?
yeah.
So it's much easier to have those tough conversations when they're still hypothetical, including the hard-hitting questions of, okay, so what will you be doing in this relationship, this business relationship? What is your area of expertise? What
Right.
aspects of the business are you going to be handling? And if they feel uncomfortable with that, when it's a conversation of what you're going to contribute, and it's still not even an actual business, as you can imagine, it just gets worse when it's an actual business with actual responsibilities and actual consequences where people's lives are going to be involved. So having that discussion, having it documented, going through and putting in place the formalities, including a partnership agreement, so which is analogous to the prenup that you talked about, of how things are going to function in good times and in bad times.
Yeah.
And what happens if somebody wants out? What does that out look like? Are they able
Mhm.
to simply sell it to whoever they want, thereby forcing you potentially into a partnership with somebody you don't want to be in a partnership with? Do they have to sell it back to you at a predetermined price? And how is that predetermined price set? Is it fair market value, and how is that determined? Is it you get paid X dollars, or you get paid a multiple of whatever the revenues and the net profit is at that time? So there's all these little nuances that are helpful for people to think through, because on the back end, it makes it much easier and clearer to be able to resolve the fewer questions that are left. So I would say have those in-depth discussions about resolving those questions, those
Yeah.
what ifs of all of the bad things that could happen,
And
including death, divorce,
I was just about to say, I
disability.
was just about to ask about death. In the event that someone passes away during the partnership, because I think that a lot of people just assume that that part of their business is just going to go over to, the other owner, or assuming that there's two, or the other owners is going to be divided up equally. What are some things that could happen if you don't have anything written in stone in terms of someone's death? Does the family now have an argument that it actually belongs to them? What does that look like in situations like that?
Yeah, great question. So an ownership in a business is generally considered personal property. So, for example, I've got this phone. Many of you probably have one similar to it. So this phone is personal property.
I'm the exact same case and
There you
everything.
go. That's great. Yeah, see?
Yeah.
So this is personal property, meaning I, upon my death, could give this to my daughter, I could give it to my wife, whoever. I get to pass this along. And that seems intuitively much clearer than, well, what about a business? Because typically you don't have anything physical in the sense of the business. You might have some stock certificates or membership certificates, or you might have a building that the business owns, and some computers and desks and other assets. But the reality of it is, it's very kind of nebulous, this idea of the business. But the reality is, it's personal property.
Yeah.
So somebody can bequeath this, meaning give it to whoever they choose upon their death. And so what happens is now this ownership in this business belongs to somebody else. And so now you've got, just like you have pretty much the same phone and case, Now you've got your piece, I've got my piece, and now we're in a partnership together, whereas you might not have even known that I'm going to be your partner or vice versa. And so you might be forced into an involuntary partnership if you don't have that in writing. So that's why it's so important to have that in writing so that's
Yeah.
determined ahead of time and you're not forced into that kind of situation.
Ron, this has been absolutely amazing. I know this is for those of you who are listening. This is a little bit different than what we normally talk about in terms of divorces and things of that nature. But I think this has been very relevant and definitely a breath of fresh air from a lot of conversations that we've had. This is, you obviously thank you for all of your experience and everything. Can you tell people where they can find you at if they are interested in working with you, or maybe they have questions about some sort of litigation? And also, do you only work in California, or because I know businesses can have franchises and things in other areas? That was another question I really didn't ask. But if someone's considering working with you, how does that work?
Yeah. Well, first, thank you so much for letting me be on this amazing podcast. Appreciate it and appreciate your great questions. In terms of where people can find me, I'm on Instagram at Parag. So my first name, Parag, my last name, Aminesq, which is short for Esquire. So Parag Amin ESQ on Instagram. You can find me on LinkedIn at Parag Amin. My website is www.lawpla.com. Again, it's www.lawpla.com. We right now really only handle cases throughout California. Eventually, we are going to be expanding out into other states, but right now, California being as big of a market as it is, I
Yeah.
want to stay focused on our core first to make sure we're servicing clients in the best way possible before we
Yeah.
start branching out to other states.
Well, whether you are watching this on YouTube or listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, make sure you go down to the comment section down below. Let Parag and I know some things that maybe you took away from today, some things that maybe you learned that you didn't know before you watched or listened to today's episode. Also, make sure you go over to all of his social media platforms, show him some additional love. Make sure you give him some follows, comment in his section, send him DMs, something that maybe you took away from today as well. And all of his information is also going to be in the show notes. So make sure that you go down into the show notes if you would like to connect with him, or if you want to refer him to a friend, family member, or maybe you're someone who's struggling with the business as well. And as always, you know how I tell people that, if you've been following this podcast for a while, I always tell people to be proactive about these type of things. So if you're in business, if you're considering business, if you're considering partnerships, don't wait until there's an issue. Resolve the issues before they're there. Talk to people who see these things, on the back end of these things. And so be proactive rather than reactive. With all that being said, thank you so much. This is the Matt Pfeiffer Experience. I am your host, Matthew Pfeiffer. I will see you in the next episode. You guys have a good one.